else. So without further ado, Rob, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to take over.
Thanks, Carmina. I'm going to put up a PowerPoint slide from my screen, and can you see that? Okay, terrific. Appreciate it, Carmina. Thanks everybody for making time today to take on this presentation. My name is Greg Moy from the Insurance Bureau of Canada. First off, I just wanted to thank Carmina, as well as the Canadian Home Builders Association, for tirelessly advocating on your industry's behalf. Last season was quite significant in terms of obviously the devastation that we've seen here in BC with the wildfires, the heat dome, the ongoing pandemic, and then also the atmospheric floods. But Carmina really got this issue to our attention, and I've very much enjoyed our time working with her and government, just to kind of go down and figure out what possible solutions there are. So myself and Rob Dupree, who you saw in the blue polo, is our National Director of Consumer Industry Relations. He'll take on the next portion of our presentation, and then we will go over just some of the trends that we've seen. And I think last year's events were quite significant and very noticeable, and a stark contrast for BC in what we've had to deal with. We'll talk about some of the best practices and also areas of interest for your companies. Later on, after our presentation, we've got obviously Ryan and Ian from Hub International. They'll touch on some of the policies that are available, some of the solutions to help best mitigate your company and the position that you guys are in. A little bit of information about us, just in case folks don't know. We're the IBC is the National Association for Canada's private home business insurers, and then across the country, private auto insurers. We represent the vast majority, about 90% of the Canadian P&C property and casualty insurance market. A lot of the work we do is quite similar to the advocacy that CHBA does for your industry. We work obviously on behalf of the property and casualty industry, for them to be able to best position to deliver their products and services. We advocate to all levels of government here in Canada. Here in BC, specifically with the provincial government, our regulator, BCFSA, and also to other consumer groups, other industry associations, such as your own CHBA, just to touch on areas that that come up that need a little bit of cleaning up, and then also to advocate for better availability and affordability of insurance for all Canadians. A little bit about our industry. So we've got about 73% of the companies that provide P&C insurance operating here in BC. So that's about 141 companies. It employs about 13,000 people spread out across the province, and a lot of the staff are interconnected with each other. Province to province, industry employs about 130,000 right across, and we contribute in terms of taxes approximately 11.7 billion to the feds as well as to the provinces. BC, some of the stats, as well as in Western Canada. If you didn't know, about 86% of some of the natural catastrophes that we saw, or sorry, 86% from the natural catastrophes that we saw in BC, as well as Alberta and Saskatchewan, contributed to about $4 billion in insured losses, which is quite significant. BC, the total number for insured losses, and I'll show you guys a couple of graphs in the coming up slides, that contributed to about 824 million in insured losses that our members have interacted with in terms of the claims and processing and just taking care of that. So I'll touch on some of the severe weather stats that we've got. This photo kind of brings back memories for me. This is actually, and some of you will recognize it, Sumas Prairie in Abbotsford. This was during the atmospheric river. You should be able to see Trans-Canada Highway somewhere in there, but I mean, these images were shown quite a bit in the province as well as across the country. And I mean, I for one had never thought that this part of the province would see the significant event take place, at least within my lifetime. But here it is, and this is what obviously the folks that were living and also farming in this community had to deal with, and including as well Merritt and Princeton. It was quite the experience to go through, and as you can see in this chart, these types of events, unfortunately, are increasing in terms of frequency of events. I should say, for how we track natural catastrophe losses, that's done by some of our policy analysts as well as CAT IQ. One event is estimated around 25 million in insured loss, and that's how it's recorded. And you can see, since the industry began to track these statistics from the mid-1980s, that the number of events has increased dramatically, especially within the last decade. Water is the new fire, and we were not spared here in BC from the flood events, but you can see also that water insured losses also significantly increasing, and the damage and destruction that comes with it. It's rather unfortunate. And in terms of averages over the decades, it's significantly increasing, especially within the last decade. So between the 1980s, 1983 to 2008, the average loss was about 422 million per year. And that has increased over the last decade. Last year, I believe it hit around 2.1 billion. You see in 2016, that was the significant Fort McMurray fire that caused quite a bit of havoc in northern Alberta, and in terms of insured loss, well over $5 billion in insured damage you see there. But it's something that we're concerned about, and as the climate continues to change, we foresee obviously more and more severe weather events happening as a result of just continuing climate change and such. These are the top 10 natural disasters in the country. 8 of the costliest disasters have happened since 2011. I've not had to show this slide in BC up until this year, after the BC floods took place, because it's now taken number 8 on our top 10 list. But you can see that these amounts are quite significant and costly. And again, a lot of it happening here in our own backyard in Western Canada. $4 billion again for some of the losses over the last couple of years. But we're not just immune here in BC, because events have taken place right across the country. For those viewers that are joining us from outside BC, we've seen significant hailstorms in Alberta. Obviously, fires are quite significant in Alberta as well. Barrie, Ontario, there was a significant tornado event which brought in about 100 million in insured damages. Windstorms, hurricane, which is not unusual for Atlantic Canada. But yeah, last year was quite significant for BC, as you can see. And these are just, again, the insured losses that made it over that $25 million mark for Lytton, White Rock Lake. Doesn't include areas like Monty Lake, which is just between Kamloops and Vernon, which also saw a number of properties that were affected. And then you have the BC floods, which again, I would say that number compiles primarily of properties that were affected. It doesn't include the structures that government would be self-insuring, such as the highways and such. That number is obviously more significant in terms of the losses that the industry has seen. So I'm going to pass it on to Rob to take on the next portion of our slides.
Thank you, Greg. And we want to touch on that the insurance industry is well capitalized for these events. So over the last couple of years, between 2020 and 2021, our industry has paid out over $80 billion, that's billion with a B, in claims across the country. There's the breakdown here between personal property, commercial, private passenger, and commercial auto, and also the liability portion. Out of those amounts, just over $4.5 billion was specifically related to severe weather. Next slide, please. So with all of this, insurance covers a couple different things. It covers the actual cash value, or it could cover replacement cost. Think of your vehicle. If you have a 10-year-old vehicle and it gets totally destroyed by a fire, you would get the actual cash value of that. But if you had a home that burned to the ground, you could potentially be getting replacement costs. That's just two types of coverages that are available. For homeowners, they do have additional living expense, meaning if they're having to evacuate, these costs cover those additional living costs, so your policy is able to respond. Businesses, they have something called business interruption. Now, if they're evacuated, they're typically not able to access that coverage. The property has to be damaged. So if your property was damaged by a fire or a flood and you have the appropriate coverage, then you would be able to claim business interruption. One point here is that insurance is the first payer. So any type of disaster financial assistance or government assistance is always one of the last payers of this process. Next slide, please. So during severe weather events, the insurance companies, they may initiate temporary restrictions for the sale of new properties in the area. And this is why we're here. You see some of the challenges when there's evacuation orders in specific properties. Trying to place coverage on some of your properties is difficult. Now, if you're just renewing a property and think of your house renewal that comes up every year, shouldn't be impacted. There's also a specific endorsement called the Declaration of Emergency Endorsement. And really what this does is if your policy is expiring while you're under this evacuation or emergency, then that'll provide an additional length of time, commonly 30 days for an extension, so that the wildfire or flood threat can pass, and then you'll be able to get new insurance. And we'll be hearing from the folks over at Hub in just a few minutes, a little bit more in detail. Next slide, please. So with all that, we do have a number of consumer tips for getting home insurance, and some of these will impact you as a home builder. So a lot of these homes, if they are trying to take possession of their home while it's under evacuation order, they may have a clause in some of their contracts subject to property insurance, or they may delay the possession date until the threat passes. Because trying to place insurance coverage, and particularly fire insurance coverage when there's an active fire in the area, is very, very difficult. But we do know that different insurance providers have different restrictions. Some may have 25 or 50 kilometer radiuses. There is one company that has a 100-kilometer radius, but we talked to them last year and they're reviewing that policy as well. That's pretty far and wide. And other companies are so sophisticated that if they understand that there's a mountain in between some of these areas, they may be able to offer coverage. So always shop around. And also ask your broker agent what options are available. And also you can add the property onto your existing policy instead of trying to get a brand new policy. That may be an option as well, but we'll leave that up to the experts at Hub to talk about that in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please. So we utilized a company called Deloitte a year or two ago just to try to better understand what was happening. And really, some of the main issues that are going on in the insurance market are just these rise in extreme weather events. The pandemic and inflation are some challenges, and also macroeconomic conditions. Things like interest rates and investment income has been impacted in the insurance industry, just like it has in many of your businesses as well. Next slide, please. So we work pretty closely with the CSA group, which is the Canadian Standards Association group. They were formerly called that, now called CSA. They've developed a whole bunch of guidelines on building resilient communities for fire and flood. And this particular one that we helped draft as well is just on wildland urban interface fires, which is what we've been experiencing in British Columbia for the last handful of years, is these wildfires. So there are these guides that when we are developing these communities with the municipalities, and many of you are impacted by this as well, for some of the design guidelines, they're trying to take those into consideration for a more resilient future. Next slide, please. So at IBC, we also have a consumer information center. So if people have general insurance questions, they can reach out to us. We are available by phone or by email to help answer general questions. We don't have details about your specific policy, and we don't sell insurance. That's what the experts are for the brokers and the agents. And we'll be hearing from some of those experts in a moment. So with that, for the next slide, Greg. So I'm happy to turn it over now to Hub International for part 2 of this session, where they're going to be specifically talking about builders' risk policies and also the available options to you. So with that, Ian, please take it away.
Thank you, Rob. Appreciate the opportunity to talk to the group. I know we had a great deal of frustration come about in our industry last year with consumers. And so it's good to try and address some of those issues in advance. And can everybody see that okay? So what we're going to talk about here is severe weather events. And we're going to focus specifically on the...
we can't see the slide, Ian. Sorry.
Oh, wait.
You might have to share your screen.
There we go.
Perfect. Thank you.
All right. So what we're going to focus on here specifically is course of construction insurance policies and what can happen either at the start of the project or at the end of the project, and how that can get affected by a severe weather event and cause a lot of problems for the builder. And do a quick overview of some of the strategies you can employ to try and avoid some of those problems. And my name is Ian Robertson. I'm a commercial insurance broker with Hub International. I've been in the insurance business for 36 years, and I'm a member of the Hub International Construction Practice Group. And joining me is Ryan. If you could introduce yourself, Ryan.
On the mute button there. Excuse me. Thanks everyone for joining us. Ryan Matson, also a commercial insurance broker. Been with Hub since 2017. Also a member of our construction practice group. Prior to joining Hub, I was an underwriter for about 10 years, including construction, course of construction, builders risk. Thanks, Ian.
You bet. And of course, you just have to give a quick disclaimer. Any advice you get here, you should check that with your actual insurance professional. This is a general overview. It's not intended to be specific advice. So with what we're going to go through is a quick agenda. We're going to look at some real life case studies of what did go wrong and can go wrong when a natural disaster causes a suspension of binding authorities that affect your project. We're going to look at strategies you can take to safeguard the project against a suspension of binding authority. We're going to look at how permission to occupy for a limited time contained in the policies can put your project at risk. And we're going to also do a quick run through of what the Declaration of Emergency Endorsement is and how that can assist your regular business and may be able to assist your COC. So the first area is case studies. So we'll look at, and these are, I've talked to a lot of our people in our different offices because we have construction practice group people all over British Columbia, and got some real case studies of the challenges that they had when the wildfire event happened in 2021. The first one was a $17 million typical 4-story frame condominium project. They'd been working on it for a year and a half. It was due to complete in July. And of course, when you get a course of construction for a COC, when the project completes, then you have to get certificates of insurance to all the banks for all of your customers who are now going to take possession of the building. And the Strata Council is formed on behalf of the strata and the builder to facilitate the strata policy. Well, in this particular case, because it was within a restricted area, within 50 kilometers of a fire, they could not secure coverage for the completed structure. So that threw everybody into a real difficult situation. The building owner and the strata unit owners faced the possibility, the people who had already closed, because you can issue a certificate of insurance to a financial institution off of the course of construction policy. But once a unit becomes occupied, the course of construction will have a time limit as to how long the course of construction policy can stay in place. And if that time limit runs up, then the whole project becomes uninsured. Any units that the builder hasn't sold yet, any of the people who are already purchased and moved in, they're suddenly without coverage. Also, if any new people who are wanting to buy a condo after the date that the course of construction runs out will not be able to get a certificate of insurance for their bank in order to take possession. And so that can cause a huge problem for the realtors. The possession date has to be delayed. Then all the real estate paperwork has to be redone. So a real nightmare, which causes a severe disruption and additional costs for all the parties involved. And so that's typically what can happen if you end up in a situation with a project completing during a wildfire season and you end up in a fire zone. So in this particular case, we did manage to negotiate a solution. And what we did was we got the insurance company to extend the allowance for occupancy for residential purposes beyond the normal time limit. And we actually ended to extend it out 2 or 3 months until such time as there was no active fire within 50 kilometers. And then at that point, we could initiate the policy for the strata corporation. So that was a good news ending on that one, but gives you an idea of what can happen. Now that's a situation that's entirely up to the individual insurance companies that you're involved with. You may be able to negotiate an extension. You may not be able to negotiate an extension. So it is a severe issue. The other case study is that one was an end of life project case study. This is more of a beginning of life project case study. So they had a $4 million health center, was scheduled to begin in June of 2021 in the BC interior. Now, it was a government funded health center. So in order to secure the funding and construction loan advances, it was a requirement. Of course, bonding had to be shown. They had to show course of construction coverage, wrap up liability, the normal package of coverages. The problem was, because it was within 50 kilometers of an active fire, no one would initiate a course of construction policy on the project. And if anybody's looked at the BC government wildfire service map on your cell phone, because there is a really good wildfire service map, and you looked at a map of the province of British Columbia in the interior in July of 2021, there wasn't too many places in the province where you weren't within 50 kilometers of an active wildfire. So in this particular case, they had to wait until the fire was 100% contained. And so it ended up severely impacting the schedule and severely impacting, of course, the costs when you have to reorganize everything. So it was a major inconvenience for the owners and all the trades involved. So ultimately, the only solution that they had in this particular case was to wait until the fire season had passed and every fire within 50 kilometers was 100% contained. And then they could initiate the coverage and then they could get the funding and initiate the project. So the project didn't start until October instead of June. So you can imagine what kind of issues that would have caused with everybody involved with the project. And that's not hard and fast rules too. Everybody has to remember, as Rob said, there's always a negotiation. There was a number of stories that we heard. One builder had 8 houses that he was doing and he had to get them done. And we were able to negotiate with London, which is kind of an insurer of last resort, gave them a ton of information about exactly where the fire was. Fire was across the lake. We didn't have one on our side of the lake. Managed to get them convinced of that. But the unfortunate part about that is being an insurer of last resort, the commensurate cost associated with it was a lot more than normal. The builder ended up paying about $40,000 for COCs on 8 homes that normally would have cost him a lot less than that. So that had a severe impact on his cost profile. Now, just so everybody is kind of aware of what we're talking about here with suspension of binding authorities, this is something that's generally done by all insurance companies wherever there's a severe weather event taking place, whether it's a fire or a flood. And what happens during a suspension of binding authorities, this is a typical notice received by brokers who are trying to place coverage during a declaration of emergency or a fire season. And it just basically comes across from all the insurance companies. It says, dear brokers, on behalf of the insurance company, with extreme conditions across the province, we remind that our guidelines for restricting buying authority in the event of a severe weather event are as such. Sometimes they're done by memo, sometimes they're contained within some of the guidelines. So they'll restrict any binding, any initiation of new coverage, and this is specific to new policies, not renewals, any area under restriction by a civil authority, any risk within 50 kilometers of a wildfire until the fire is 100% contained, and any risk in any area that is under evacuation or evacuation alert. So these can vary slightly between insurance companies. As Rob indicated, sometimes they say 100 kilometers, but that's rare. Usually it's 50 kilometers. But there's not a lot of difference between insurers and how they attack these severe weather events. They'll just blanketly, and we have to remember that we're dealing with underwriters from insurance companies. And these underwriters primarily are housed in office buildings in the major centers. So they don't have a grasp, and they can't individually underwrite. So they don't have a grasp of the individual situation. Your project might be in the middle of downtown Kamloops, and it's still suspended for buying authority because it's within 50 kilometers of a fire. And then you have to do the whole negotiation with the insurance company and say, well, yeah, I know it's within 50 kilometers of a fire, but it's in downtown Kamloops. Like, we're not going to have an issue here. And so sometimes you can get exceptions granted, but you can't guarantee an exception getting granted. So while there are those individual exceptions, at the bottom line is if you're trying to get a new policy put into place, if you're within 50 kilometers of an active fire, you're probably not going to be able to secure coverage, right? And we see we've had a number of examples of that this year where we couldn't close on, and it affects not only construction, it also affects, if you're buying a home from someone else and it happens to be during the fire season, suddenly you can be in a situation where you can't secure coverage and you can't close your real estate deal. So real estate deals have to get delayed. So that's the problem. Some of the strategies that you can do to safeguard the insurance on your project against the suspension of binding authorities. And you really can't do anything after the binding authority has put into effect. You have to be proactive. So we see this typically with, especially in the interior, a lot of people, they decide to do a project, they get working on it in the spring, get the foundation dug, get the foundation in. People don't want to spend a whole bunch of money on insurance because, of course, the construction insurance coverage, everybody knows, gets paid for monthly. It's the length of the time period that you have the course of construction phase that drives the cost. So they do the foundations and everything like that. And they say, okay, we've got the foundations all done. Now we're going to start our framing. So we're going to get our first bank draw. And so we're going to go and get some insurance. And normally in years past, that's been a process that can be done in as little as a day. Some companies have online portals. It's a fairly simple process. Maybe 2 or 3 days, you've got your certificate, everything goes fine. Then you find out that your project is within 50 kilometers of fire and you cannot get coverage. You cannot get coverage. You cannot get the bank financing. You can't continue with your project. So one of the things you can do is a smart idea is if you know you're going to have a project that's going to be built over the summer and you're getting the foundation and everything ready in April and May, while it's still raining in May, initiate your course of construction coverage. Once you've got the coverage and the coverage runs for a year, and if wildfire happens within 10 kilometers of your project, they can't cancel the coverage on you. So you do have that guarantee of coverage through the severe weather season. So that also, by initiating your course of construction coverage prior to the suspension of the binding authority, that ensures that you may not need to give the bank a certificate yet, but when the time comes to give the bank a certificate, you'll be able to provide them with one. Another strategy to employ too is if you've got an ongoing project and you've got your normal construction schedule set up, try not to have it terminate with possession dates in the fire season. I know it sounds like a difficult thing to try and plan around, but it's a good just in case scenario. So if you have an insurance and you think it's going to be done in July, buy the insurance all the way to September, just in case. Worst case scenario, you can delay some of the construction and still work on the project and still have the project under construction while the threat passes. So having, and this is especially pertinent when it comes to commercial projects as opposed to residential projects. Some course of construction insurers, and Brian will talk to the wordings in a little bit. Some course of construction insurers are pretty lenient on who can move in, others not so much. So if you have even if you have a concrete project completing in Vernon on July the 15th, your person you're selling it to may not be able to initiate coverage. So it's always good to have planning your expiry dates, perhaps plan them outside of the fire season. That way, at least you've still got the guarantee of coverage continuing, even if you have to maybe delay occupancy of it. So it's really important to pay attention, and you always hear this from guys like me, you know, nobody reads policies, but at the end of the day, it's a good idea to have a look at those sections and see what potential problems you could run into on the wordings. Check for declaration of emergency endorsements, not common in COCs, but more common in regular policies. Check the permission to occupy by type and time constraint. So the wording at the end of the day, the contract with your insurance company is going to dictate what happens at the end of life of a project as to what you can and can't do. One thing you probably won't be able to do is get a new policy. So I'll turn it over to Ryan here to talk specifically about the wordings involved. How the permission to occupy for a limited time can put your project at risk.
Thank you, Ian. So we're going to narrow down the topic of theme of today's presentation. We'll be talking to you guys about cessation of coverage. So we have a sample wording here, which we're going to run through, which you can see is a typical policy verbiage for cessation of coverage wording. Now it's becoming more and more important to really narrow down how this verbiage would trigger, being able to implement a COC policy course of construction, and also how things are going to look when the COC policy is set to expire. So we'll go through this wording and sort of talk about why it's important to be mindful of how these wordings play out and when we can implement a COC, when it's expiring, and how that would influence our ability to place an annual policy once the COC is expired and the project is completed. So we talked about we're having more fires. We have a higher density people living in fire-prone areas. So we've seen last year it's becoming very important to look into this portion of the COC wording. So we'll go through the wording here. So this is a typical cessation of coverage wording we took from one of our carrier partners. So this firm ceases to insure the project. So we have first one, 30 days after commencement or use of occupancy for any section. The key here is unless such occupancy is for construction, so if it's still under construction. So the one here I'd like to highlight, so we have office, habitational, banking, retail, or parking. So typically here we would not see anything other than habitational. So effectively, if we have a course of construction that's a residential building, apartment strata, we can start to have units, people move into their units, and we have 30 days, after that time, then we'll have to implement the, annual policy for the apartment or strata policy. So this is a broad wording because we have offices, banking, retail, parking, in addition to the habitational residential. Typical is just residential. what else here? So, we'll have testing, commissioning of the building equipment. So the elevator systems, the HVAC, when the project site is left unattended for more than 30 days. So that's typical. We would see a similar policy verbiage, a vacancy policy verbiage in a standard annual policy, or if construction has ceased for more than 30 days. So the intent of the insurance carriers there is, the project is at completion. It's at a time where their intent is to switch the COC over to an annual policy. Then the last one there is when the policy expires. So what we're getting at here is just want to be mindful of, if we have a project that's in a fire-prone area, and that could be quite broad, 50 kilometers. Last year we had a small fire in, I believe it was Maple Ridge somewhere. So it actually brought the fire area well west of the interior. One thing I will say is the underwriters at the insurance carriers, they use publicly available BC fire maps. So anyone could go in and look at the fire maps. They're using the same thing. They're waiting to see when that fire is switched from sort of red to green under control. At that point, we're able to implement coverage. So this is the sample wording again, but it's a good idea to talk to your broker or agent, and they will shop around for you. Different COC wordings, they're not created equal. Some have a broader wording, such as this one here. It's probably good for this slide in. So here are some things we can think about, to try to get around, bonding restrictions if we're able to implement a COC policy. In addition, when the policy will expire. So we can see here, be mindful, pay attention, permission to occupy provisions. So when it can be occupied, when the policy ceases, when it will expire. Usually it's 30 days permission for occupancy, depending on the course of construction insurance carrier. Some of them are a bit more open for negotiation. But again, sometimes it's good to, maybe think ahead and see if the carrier is, a bit more open for negotiation, and also be very mindful of our, when we implement the COC and, look ahead 12, 18, 24 months ahead to see what it's going to expire. So, might want to, if we can, not have the COC policy expire sort of June, July, August in fire season. Another one is, we have residential permission for occupancy. Residential is typically somewhat of a lower exposure or lower hazard. So the COC insurers will allow for occupancy. Anything higher hazard, so the previous slide, so think processing facilities, manufacturing, welding shops, wood processing, that kind of thing. We could run into some issues if we have a COC expiring during fire season. So we'll get into this in the next slide with a sample declaration of emergencies endorsement that Ian's going to go through. They're not always available, but I'll hand it over to you for that, Ian. You're muted.
Okay. Sorry. I thought Carmina had to do that, but she's the one who muted me.
Nope.
All right. Hey, so just wanted to follow up with that. The declaration of emergency endorsement, I just wanted to go through that quickly because that's something that's contained in almost everybody's regular insurance policy. But it's not very common, unfortunately, in course of construction policies. Now, just so you know what a declaration of emergency policy does for you, this is a typical wording. And it basically says if there's a declaration of emergency by the civil authorities during when your policy is coming up for renewal, an insurance company may have told you, hey, I'm not going to renew your policy this year. And you have to find different insurance. And so you may be trying to look for different insurance, and then all of a sudden an emergency happens and you're not out of luck. Declaration of emergency endorsement is basically put in there to protect your rights as a policyholder so that the insurance company is required to continue your policy for an extended period of time during the declaration of emergency. We had situations like that where we had, $100 million manufacturing plants and the insurers were reducing their capacity. And as of December 31st, they only wanted to write 50% of it. But of course, being right after the flood, no insurance company was providing any binding authorities. So this declaration of emergency endorsement basically forced the insurance company to insure the policy for another 3 months until the binding authority the suspension of binding authority was lifted, and we could place coverage on the balance of the policy. So the only provision on there is that the total term shall not exceed 120 days, and it ceases 30 days after the end of the declaration of emergency. And just again, COC policies do not have a declaration of emergency endorsement. If you can negotiate one into the contract, it's a good idea. And some companies have the wordings for them. You just have to negotiate that in advance if you know you're going to have some exposure to the fire season. It doesn't hurt to ask. Other than that, you have to use one of the other strategies we've talked about previously. And that's kind of summarizes everything. As mentioned before, with the Hub International Construction Practice Group, I've put a link to our Construction Practice Group website there. We have a lot of very good information on there if you have questions about all things construction and risk. I've got a contact information for myself and Ryan there. If you have any follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out. And thank you all for your time for the presentation today. Appreciate the opportunity to speak.
Thanks so much, everybody.
All right. Well, thanks, Ian, Ryan, as well as Greg and Rob. We have about 10 minutes left of today's session, and I really want to open it up to this group and to anyone who might have questions. I know that was a lot of information, and hopefully you guys found that information helpful. I do see a comment coming in here from Eddie. Eddie, would you like to maybe speak to the group? I would invite you to do that. Otherwise, I'm happy to read.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I was just saying this presentation is crazy. I'm here in my design office, as you can hear someone's on the phone. But yeah, I'm telling everyone as you speak, like, hey, do you know what can happen? Like, this is crazy.
Yeah, and I can respond to that one. Absolutely agree with you. The natural catastrophes and particularly severe weather, we're seeing a lot more frequency and severity, particularly over this past decade. One of the slides we showed the vast majority, 8 out of 10 of Canada's costliest insured events have happened since 2011. A lot of those were focused in Alberta and now British Columbia, but we're not immune across the country. Other events have happened in Ontario and many other places as well. This is where we really need to work together, and we're working with, as an industry, with government to really develop and build these resilient communities. I know the provincial government and Emergency Management BC, it's Emergency Preparedness Week this week. So just a reminder of everyone of that, a lot of good information that's available online and in the media. But there are things that we need to do, and we're working closely with the government. They made a lot of announcements earlier this year about the emergency management process and just some additional funding for a variety of projects. So that's really good news. But we are seeing those increases, and we just want everybody to be prepared as we enter into this severe weather season.
And I know, like, from our perspective as well, how challenging it is to anticipate these instances, especially for projects where you sort of need that certainty to move forward, especially during this season where it is construction season. And I know the industry is working as much as possible to be able to build more resiliently, to adapt to these changes. But it's hard because we're also trying to keep up with housing needs. So there's a lot of competing priorities. And like Rob said, we're trying to convey and develop solutions with the government as much as possible, and trying to figure out what's the best way forward in light of all these anticipated disasters and needs that we have.
Now, one common question as we're waiting for people to formulate their questions is, we talked a lot about brokers and agents, and a lot of people may not be familiar with the difference between a broker and an agent. So there's advantages, and maybe ask Ian or Ryan if you just want to touch on some of those differences and maybe some of the advantages of a broker.
Yeah, so the main difference between a broker and agent is an agent works directly for the insurance company. If you talk to a cooperatives agent, for instance, the cooperatives agent places coverage on behalf of the cooperatives insurance company and only the cooperatives insurance company. Whereas a broker is kind of like a mortgage broker. You go to a broker, give him all the underwriting information. He asks you a bunch of questions about everything, your project. And then he takes that information and goes to a number of different insurance companies, and he'll have contracts for placement with anywhere from 15 to 50 different insurance companies that he can go to. The other avenue that you can get is a direct writer. And a direct writer, rather than dealing with someone individually on behalf of the insurance company, you deal directly with a call center from the insurance company. So those are your three central distribution models for insurance that we have in Canada today.
And with that, I think one thing to point out, Ian, is that a broker represents a number of different companies. So they do a lot of shopping for you. We see a lot of the course of construction policies with a broker because they have access to a lot of different markets. I know in the presentation, we talked about an international insurance company called Lloyd's, and that's a large international organization that has ties around the world. And because of some of these international markets, some of the direct writers or the agents may not have that same type of access that a broker does.
Yes, and you'll see that primarily anybody on the call who's involved in construction, you've probably had course of construction policies that have been underwritten by Lloyd's. Quite often Lloyd's uses agents called managing general agents that organize Lloyd's facilities on behalf of a number of brokers in Canada. And ultimately the paper and the ultimate payment comes from Lloyd's of London. Lloyd's of London is the largest property insurer in the world by volume. And so it's not unusual for your project to be in a roundabout way insured by Lloyd's. The paper may say I3 or Taunton or CanSure, but ultimately the security quite often is Lloyd's of London's contracts. And I know in our world, we often place stuff directly with Lloyd's. Like the one example I gave of the gentleman who had the 8 houses that he had to get insured, that was done on what's called a Lloyd's open market placement, where you just take all the information on the risk and it's provided into this facility at Lloyd's, which is called the open market, where the underwriters can look at the risk and say, okay, I'm willing to insure that for X.
I do see that Eddie has a follow-up question. Eddie, feel free to ask a question.
Yeah. So I was just mentioning here in the office. So my father-in-law, he's sort of 80 years old, and he had a successful insurance business for his, like most of his life, retired now. Being a bit older, he's conservative and, a bit anti-climate change and, loves burning fossil gas and all that. But I just was reflecting that if he was a young man in the insurance industry, he would be like a passionate climate advocate. Like it seems like everyone in the insurance industry has to be that way because, your entire business model is like being shaken by all this. So I was just curious what the Insurance Bureau Canada, well, again, then just one other thing, like I have just come to like a full realization in the past week or two, how much greenwashing, in particular Fortis BC, a big utility that sells fossil gas in British Columbia, but also other, I went to log into my bank the other day, RBC, and they've just sustainability everywhere over their front page on their website. And it's like, yeah, but you're funding fossil fuel projects. I saw HSBC in the UK has just been penalized because they did the same thing, talking about sustainability, and not mentioning that they're increasing emissions. So I was just wondering how Insurance Bureau Canada is advocating for climate, and like, if greenwashing, or if other government policies, like government supporting big new fossil fuel projects, like all these things that are just going to make that graph that you're showing is just going to get exponentially worse, right?
Yeah, so I'll maybe start it off from what we are advocating here provincially, and then maybe I'll let Rob touch on some of our federal initiatives. But I think when you look at the province's Clean BC plan, it does a very good job in terms of a overall holistic provincial strategy towards emissions reduction. I think there are areas in Clean BC that needs a little bit more attention, and this is an area where we've been advocating with the provincial government as well as other stakeholders in terms of improving some of the strategies for adaptation. Flood mapping, one example, is an area where we've been working with multiple jurisdictions, regional districts, local governments, provincial as well as the federal governments, to see some sort of investments in it. But this doesn't obviously happen overnight. These are initiatives that will obviously affect communities within the medium to long term. But there are areas that we feel very strongly about in terms of better resilient infrastructures against a fire or floods, very much so in the interior, but also in terms of downstream towards major metropolitans like Metro Vancouver, because we're obviously in the basin for the Fraser River, and a lot of the mountains that collect quite a bit of snow, that all drains down towards the Pacific Ocean. So it's an area where we're still working with the provincial government. They're currently in the process of developing the province's new adaptation strategy, which hasn't been updated since 2010. So they're just on their second draft, and because of the events of last season, it's delayed some of the work. But we've been advocating some of the things that we believe is very important to be included in the new strategy that will affect the province's decisions going forward.
Just touching on that as well is Climate Proof Canada, something we didn't talk about. This is a coalition of like-minded stakeholders, insurance organizations, Indigenous groups, municipalities, and other non-government organizations that are really trying to work with the federal government to develop some type of a national adaptation strategy. I'm not a climate scientist, but we know from the numbers that we are seeing more frequent and more severe weather events across the country. So with all that, we have formed a new organization, a new coalition. We're working with them to try to address some of these situations today, and importantly into the future as well.
I think it was Rob. Oh no, Greg was. You talked about the province's 30 by 30. Something I'm just like, I don't get about it is, the IPCC is saying that we need to make a 55% cut by 2030. And so, we're kind of making half of the cut that the scientists are telling us to make. How does the insurance, effectively for the insurance industry, that means that you can just project that this is going to get a whole lot worse by 2030. Correct?
Sorry, I'm not too familiar with the 30 by 30 number. I have heard that from Fortis BC. Is that what you're referring to?
Well, yeah, and my problem is with Fortis BC because they're greenwashing all of my potential clients. Like I can't even sell sustainability to potential homeowners. Like I try and tell people you should take fossil gas out of your house, and they're like, no, fossil gas is good, electricity is bad. I'm like, oh my God, you've been brainwashed. But Fortis they say that their climate target is 30% by 2030, and the reason for that is because the province's target is a 30% reduction in emissions by 2030. But if you head over to the IPCC, they say we need to make a 55% cut by 2030 in order to give us only a 50-50 chance of avoiding, like a catastrophic warming event. So, if the province is actively targeting like half of what the scientists are saying, that means you guys would be able to just project that graph you showed at the start of the increase in catastrophic losses, that'll just continue to get bigger, right?
Yeah, so I'm going to come to you for advice on emissions reductions and such. I think you've got a little bit better understanding than I do. We focus on a lot of the unsexy stuff, like making some of the storm sewers much more resilient, larger. I think about areas like False Creek in Vancouver, where around Science World area, where you see constant flooding, and those communities have been rebuilt just before the Vancouver Olympics, and yet you're still seeing challenges there. And part of the issue there is also because it's in kind of reclaimed lands. So one of the areas that we touch on is like, do we need to have a discussion? And we would argue that we probably should, especially in terms of building in low-lying areas and areas where there's known flood risk. And we've seen the drastic results, specifically in downtown Merritt, as well as Abbotsford out in the Suez Prairies.
And Eddie, just to respond, we know that there are challenges with consumer choices and how they choose to heat their homes, electricity versus gas. We know that there is a push for in Clean BC to electrify, but we also recognize that in some areas of the province, FortisBC is in some ways necessary because the gas is a predominant choice. It can be a bit more cheaper depending on what the situation and circumstances are. And so there is that perspective on understanding what is the consumer choices and what's the best option right now. And a lot of our advocacy has been around, how can we change consumer preferences, and what are some of the decisions that are made around that, and incentives that are being offered through Clean BC, which have been cut and slashed recently, are important to influence consumer decisions. And but we do believe that FortisBC does also have a role to play still, especially with some of the severe cold snaps that we're seeing in the province. And again, we're all navigating this changing landscape together. So I'm happy to welcome any of the feedback that you have on that, Eddie. And, our industry is faced with its own GHG targets that we need to meet. The province has outlined what our emissions reductions needs to be, and our Pauline Roop, who is our technical director of building services, has been working closely with the province on what that looks like in terms of new building construction and what kind of footprint we provide. I recognize that we are 3 minutes past 10:30, and I want to be mindful of everyone's time. Thank you everyone for joining, and I hope you found this information and this presentation helpful. Again, we will circulate the materials and have the recording available in case you do want to share it with any of your colleagues or know someone that would be interested and wasn't able to join. I guess before we leave, is there anything with the upcoming season that this industry needs to be aware of? I know we've seen some reports about another extreme heat weather this summer. Any thoughts that you want to leave with this group today, Rob, Greg, Matt?
Yeah, one of my first thoughts is don't delay, start the preparations now. We heard from Ian and Ryan that we need to be doing things before the severe weather season is upon us and you're having problems because of emergency events that are happening. So this is really where you need to be reaching out, and guys like Ian and Ryan, these are experts in their field. They have a lot of information that they can share. They have a lot of experience in navigating these policies. So it's making sure that you're talking to that experienced, knowledgeable person as soon as you can to try to get things in place and get things set up. We know that severe weather is going to happen. We just need to be as prepared as we can be.
Yeah, great point, Rob. Just to echo that, pre-planning is the key. There's not much that you can do. And unfortunately, you can't plan floods as easy as you can in fire season. But that's one of the unfortunate things that you have to put in your planning process is the what if there is a suspension of binding authority, and how do we deal with that? And it may not be You may not be able to change the schedule, but then if at least you can have a situation where you have a plan to, if you have to, change the closing dates on a project.
All right, so we'll leave it there for now. Thank you everyone again for joining us, and have a good day. Go get your insurances, and we'll talk to you later.
Thanks, everyone.
Much.